Hi, I'm David Dillard. I'm president of D2 Architecture and the founder of the Sleepover Project. A few years ago, I had the responsibility of putting a bunch of architects to work in a time when the economy was sort of slow. So we decided to use our time for research, and we launched the Sleepover Project. Essentially, each architect would go spend 24 hours in a senior living community impersonating someone in their 90s, particularly in a skilled care memory support environment. They'd go into the environment at noon one day and come out noon the next, and they would have a blank journal with a certain set of questions and things to observe. And the idea is that we do this 40 times in 40 places across the country and collect the data and really make a difference about the way places get designed in the future. So what you're about to see are testimonials of several of our friends and architects who've been out to do these sleepovers so far. I think you'll find the observations fascinating.
Noise wasn't really too much of a factor. It was a pretty quiet community. I did wake up a couple times in the early morning hearing the elevator start dinging as probably staff were coming up. As I was going to bed, I could hear a few TVs down the hall. I think residents tended to keep their doors open and the TV's on, they'd probably fall asleep. So there's kind of some of that ambient noise, but nothing very severe at all, nothing that kept me up at night.
In one of the sleepovers where I was assigned to a skilled nursing facility, noise was a major issue. They were in an institutional setting from a building built in the 60s, and they had a very large nurse station located right in the middle, and then wings that just went off in the standard kind of star-shaped horseshoe pattern. And I noticed the staff, as they gravitated towards those nurses to be close to them and feel more secure, would sleep around that command center. And I tried to do it so I could see what it was like, and I couldn't sleep. There were so many bells and whistles and horns and phones and everything going off that I was amazed that any resident could sleep or stay close to it and not be distracted. So I learned from that experience to try and do everything I could to keep some of those systems and alarms and bells and whistles hidden from the residents' view so that it doesn't distract them, but still easily accessible for the nurses. On one of the sleepovers that David and I did concurrently in Iowa, it was very beneficial for me to observe how the staff treated him in particular. He was assigned a condition that he had just suffered a stroke and had lost the use of the left side of his whole body. And so he was confined to a wheelchair. The staff in general, when we came in for the first shift, knew that we were pretending and kind of went through the motions, and I got to watch how they treated him. They told the second shift who took over, and they continued to take us through all the processes that were necessary for residents like us. But I don't think they told the third shift. And so I watched as a nurse assistant came in who was a huge man, very powerful, looked like he used to be a linebacker, took very careful, very gentle care of David as he had to lift him from the wheelchair into the chair for dinner or into the bathroom or whatever it was that was necessary. And so we went through the night and we came back, first shift came back on, and during the transition, it was at lunch. The director of the facility then came in after lunch and he said, "David, Grant, we're done. Come on, let's talk about what you learned." And so David got out of the chair and walked across the dining room, and that poor nurse assistant, his eyes just went big. It's a miracle.
The first sleepover I did was, and I've done 3 total, was several years ago. And the most dramatic discovery that I made was about how people tended to gather together more so than I ever imagined. It's a lonely experience. So they spent as much time, many of them did, outside the room as possible. And where did they go? They went to the nurses' station. So inevitably, when we traveled in our wheelchairs and in our capacities as fake residents around the community, we found essentially any given time 6 or 8 old men lined up looking across the big pink laminate counter at the 30-year-old women who were there running the place, you know, and there's no mystery about why they were there and what they wanted to do. It was just chit-chat with the pretty girls. So what we did as a result is we got up the next day and went to design projects where we would make wonderful living environments that, oh, by the way, where people could sit around and socialize. But the key difference was This was a living room with fireplaces and soft seating and nice soft lighting and things like that. And oh, by the way, it had just enough of a desk or furniture to be a nurse's station. So we just turned the whole thing upside down.
One of the things I learned the most from the sleepovers that I've done is that the caregivers are so important and so passionate about caring for our elders that it inspired me to try and find ways to make their jobs just a little bit easier so they could spend more time with each resident. One of the things I learned on the sleepovers that there was a concern of most of the administrators and staff was controlling odor, because it could be such a bad thing for residents and for our family that came over. A lot of the facilities I stayed at did a very good job of controlling odor. I was actually surprised.
Odor wasn't an issue at the place I stayed. In fact, the staff noted that they were proud with the fact that the odor was not an issue at all. They, said in other places they had worked that it wasn't so great, but here it was not a problem at all.
In one of the sleepovers I did, I was assigned to an Alzheimer's facility, and there was always a concern about odor. One of the residents apparently liked to use one of the air conditioners under his window as a toilet. So one of the things I learned is how important it is to help an Alzheimer's resident visually cue to their bathroom, because again, they're suffering from confusion and may forget that's where they need to go. It made me a little bit more sensitive to material selection, so that we always were very careful about selecting materials that would fight odor or that have antimicrobial properties or that were easily cleanable.
One of the ones I really noticed was that the residents seemed very territorial over their seats. I also found out that the staff actually assigns them a seat, and if they want to move to a different table, they have to put in a request, and I thought that was really interesting.
The dining experience was a good one. The food was great, no complaints there at all. One of the interesting things I noticed was that the residents kind of segregated themselves into men and women. I thought that was kind of interesting. So there was the guys' table and the girls' table, and while the dining area was set up for multiple four-top tables, but they ganged them together to make one long kind of family-style table for each, and so the guys would all sit at one table and the girls would sit at the other.
The entire dining room was done in four tops, and it seemed to work out pretty well. The navigation was actually a little bit more difficult for the wait staff to get food in and out to all the residents versus a long bench-style table. The residents and staff both seemed to like it very well. They were able to put people where they wanted to sit. Somebody didn't want to sit next to somebody else. They didn't feel like they had to sit next to them on a bench or right next to each other at a long table. They liked the smaller table sizes.
When I dined, it was all in one big dining room. And so a lot of people just wanted to eat at a little table by themselves. And so I thought, why don't we do different spatial designs in our dining rooms? Because elderly people, some of them are a little curmudgeon-y. They want to be by themselves even when they eat. It was a common thread that ran through conversations where people don't like being together. They felt like they were in high school.
The other thing that I think is a really important design tool to think about is there's a lot of people in that space over and above just the resident. And so when you're looking at a dining room and you go, what's the minimum occupancy that I need to have in here per square footage? One thing you're not factoring in is the amount of staff that's in there. And also, a lot of these residents may actually have a private nurse that stays with them 24/7.
There were not very many guests. There were a couple guests that came for lunch one day during the 24 hours I was there. The staff did not eat with us, but they stayed in the area to help, serve and clean up and just check on us to make sure that we had what we needed, that kind of thing. I was confined to a wheelchair because I'd had a total knee replacement, as they put it, and I had 50% bearing capacity on one knee. So this was my first time in a wheelchair ever, so learning how to get around in a wheelchair was a little more difficult than I had anticipated. So I became much more aware of things like thresholds between material changes, and even things like going through doors and just maneuvering was a little tricky.
I had to use a walker, or a rollator, as I later learned they were called. One thing I found that it was really hard to do was to open a door. The assisted living units was about 4 feet 6 inches wide, the corridor, and that meets code, but I had to make a zigzag pattern, and it took me a couple of minutes just to get out of my front door.
It really brought to light in my mind the need for thoughtfulness and arranging spaces and thinking about the procedure of moving throughout spaces and doorways and things.
Another thing that I noticed about moving around is the way people who still had their mobility used the furniture in the dining room. Anything that's heavy enough to lean on becomes a lean rail. Not only do they use the handrails in the hallways, but in the really big rooms, it's the furniture they constantly lean. And if it's not there, then they have to go along the walls and lean. And it was really interesting to me. The assisted living facility that I stayed in was about 15 years old, I think. And it had some thresholds at the doorways that weren't flush. So if you're very frail and you have a walker, you can barely push yourself over something that's even that tall.
You know, there was always, multiple staff around in any given place, able to help people with, eating or just getting set up. So I think that was kind of a nice, added to the comfort level of care.
The facility was well lit, both artificially and naturally, and the windows were nice. There was large windows in every resident. However, almost all the lighting in the whole facility was fluorescent. Anybody who knows anything about lights knows that fluorescent lights are not conducive to aesthetics on the skin,
And most of the time I was in a skilled care community, and sometimes I was in a memory support community. And daylighting has an interesting effect, I learned as a sleeper, on the attitude of the people in a particularly memory support community. They can get emotionally high or low depending on the quality of the light.
The lights were pretty harsh in that aspect, and also the light, the overbed light for exam, I found it. The staff typically kept it on, so there was a lot of glare directly in my face when I was trying to sleep.
So it made us aware for the first time. We act like we know all this stuff, but when you really get into a sleepover environment and you begin discussing and learning firsthand what it's like to be be a resident of that age, and you look around and you empathize suddenly with the emotional rises and falls that the community itself goes through, that your fellow residents go through. And one of the factors is lighting. There are a lot of different factors, but one of them is lighting. So we became a lot more sensitive and interested in the technicalities of lighting to make things better for the residents. That's the artificial side of it. Another problem with daylighting is there's a phenomenon where different ways that aging eyes hurt. So that, for example, lights that are at the one end of a room that are bright in daylight, like today, really do physically hurt the eyes.
I think there would be some great indirect lighting options. Either an uplight for exam or a functional, operable light you can physically move and adjust where you want it to point would also be great. They did a lot with the lights, a lot of pendant lights instead of just troffers or can lights versus troffers. So it was very warm, very comfortable being there.
So we try to get a lot of lighting, but it's a lot of indirect lighting. And one of the things we try to avoid particularly is a big window at the end of a shiny floor corridor, not only does it hurt the eyes, but it also is a pretty unfortunate metaphor. It's a light at the end of the tunnel, which is not necessarily a good idea for people this age.
We install a lot of carpet in the hallways and corridors because it adds to the residential feel and cuts down on noise and stuff, but the rolling resistance between the tires of the wheels of the wheelchair and the carpet really made it hard for me to independently move around.
Most of the floors at the assisted living center where I stayed were like an LVT or VCT tile. There was carpet in my room, but it was a short Berber, which I noticed it wasn't very hard to get around because it was a 1/4 inch Berber and it didn't have much padding underneath. So I didn't think that it was too hard to get around on it, but it was the transitions at the doorways that were the real problem.
The finishes in the facility I was in were really nice. They used wall coverings instead of paint. Carpet in the whole facility, a lot of drywall, gypsum board ceilings, drop down ceilings versus ACT. The corridors, there's a lot of molding. They did a lot with the lights, a lot of can lights versus troffers. So it was very warm, very comfortable being there. I think it was really helped by the finishes instead of if they'd come in and put in vinyl cove, baseboards, and just painted the walls.
In one of the facilities I stayed at, they had me go through the bathing process where they didn't have private showers in the resident rooms, so they would bring everyone down once a day or once every other day to a communal bath where they had a very large therapy tub and shower that would take me out of the wheelchair over the side of this large spa tub and put me into the tub. And I thought going into the room, this won't be any issue because, hey, I used to skydive, I love to bungee jump. But I was actually very nervous on that lift because it was so flimsy and it felt rickety, and I tried to put myself into the mind of a resident who was frail and thought, if I fall, I'm going to get seriously hurt out of this thing.
The bathing situation is absolutely terrifying. You essentially get in a special apparatus, either a lift, depending on the infirmity they've assigned you, or they put you in a wheelchair, and they roll you very publicly down the hallway, past all the staff and all the guests and all the other residents. So you make it into the bathing room itself, and the caretaker is going to bathe you. But I was shocked at the genderlessness of the entire experience. Guys were helping ladies, ladies were helping guys, and it was just totally an androgynous experience.
What I took away from that was to make sure that whenever we did these kinds of bathing settings, we tried to select fixtures that would not require that kind of lift, that a resident could step into very gently through a door or a drop side on the tub.
The exposure was startling, and so so we come back to again and we think, how can we position the bathing spaces to be a little more discreetly positioned? And more, since our first sleepover, clients are onto this, and they're finding ways to budget more private bathing spaces in each room.
Being on the second floor, the connection to the outside was a little different than you might be used to in your house. I did have a visual connection to the landscape outside, which was nice. I noticed the windowsills tended to be lower, about 2 feet off the floor, so that let me look down and kind of see what was going on in the courtyards and outside.
One of the things I learned on the sleepovers that I did was how important landscaping is, especially in one of the sleepovers that I did at a skilled nursing facility where most of the residents couldn't go outside. They just weren't physically able anymore, or were too susceptible to temperature changes or whatever.
As far as getting to the landscape and being able to enjoy it myself, I was certainly allowed to do that, but I had to have a staff person accompany me and let me basically, key me into the elevator and take me downstairs, wheel me, to the outside door, which was probably too hard for me to open in a wheelchair by myself anyway.
Yeah, landscaping is something that we have a completely different perception at our age and younger of what the residents appreciate about the landscaping. To them, it's a symbol of freedom.
One of the other things I noticed was that it was kind of hard to find a shady spot. It was in the summertime and it was kind of hot, so we had to kind of search around to find, a bench that was in the shade. So that's something to be mindful of, I think, as we work with our landscape designers on that.
They looked out the window a lot, and I thought one of the most important things I learned was to try to provide different kinds of views. Some people were early risers and needed a view out to the east. Some were night people and liked to look out to the west to see the sunset. So the importance of bringing the landscape into the building for those people became very critical, and to provide multiple choices of views for different kinds of residents.
Over and over and over in these sleepovers, and all the sleepers are coming back and reporting basically the same thing. Hardly anybody uses the outside spaces at all. The important thing about landscaping is it's something to look at. And it's not just the prettiness in the landscape as an aesthetic presentation, but it's something to look at and think, if I wanted to, I could open that door and walk out there.
One thing that I noted was that if near the main room, say the dining room, they had a little outdoor patio that had automatic opening doors, that it would have benefited the residents a lot because they could have gone outside, they could have a little garden out there. But as it was, there wasn't really any access to landscaping.
I had the privilege of staying in a facility where I had access to their original programmatic requirements, to the original blueprints that were drawn up for the building. And then 10 years later, I had the opportunity to stay in that facility. And so I got to look back at what the rooms were now versus 10 years ago, what they were supposed to be. And the staff, through time and semi-evolutionary process, was able to go, I need this over here more than I need this over there. And so that's something that we need to really keep in mind, is to keep our buildings adaptable for the future.
My most important takeaway, I think, was the need to be mindful of the detail and the design of the units themselves, and particularly the bathroom. The sequence of getting from your room into the bathroom or from the hall into your room. There seemed to be a tendency for some congestion there. I know the bathroom was designed to be accessible, so it meets all the clearance requirements and everything, but even so, it was still a little bit of a challenge to be able to maneuver properly in there.
I was assigned in a memory support facility I was suffering from early onset dementia, and so they would attach devices like monitors to my collar and a wristband to my arm to monitor where I was going. And David, being the troublemaker he was, conned me into going to get him a Diet Coke from the staff break room. And so sure enough, I totally forgot I was wearing the monitors. I got up and I went right through the door that was being monitored and set off all the alarms. I learned to be more sympathetic towards those suffering from chronic confusion disorders like Alzheimer's.
What we are coming away with is an enlarged heart for the people that we're designing for. And Florence is a perfect example. I met Florence at a first senior living community I stayed in a few years ago in California. Florence was wearing a lapel pin, a little pin on her blouse that said Pearl Harbor, and I asked her about that, and she said, well, it's a reminder of my husband, and it's a very special day. I was standing on a front porch in Honolulu watching Japanese fighter jets fly down our street en route to Pearl Harbor. And my husband was in the back of the house changing clothes so he could go to the shipyard and fight back. So all these stories leave you with a more motivation, more passion to do what you do.
The most important thing I learned during the sleepover was compassion, because you can't design for people unless you know how they live. I didn't know how they lived, and I was designing buildings for them. The day before I was this arrogant designer, and then I went in and I found out that I was doing a lot of things wrong. So that's what I took away, how to be a better designer and to help people.